Okay, hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and today I get a real treat. I get to talk with a new friend. We've only met 5 minutes ago. This is David Moscrop. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ottawa, and a few months ago, I happened to come across his book called "Too Dumb for Democracy?" Question mark. And I thought, that's exactly the question. That's the question. I don't want to think about that, but that is the question. Are we too dumb? Because clearly there's something wrong with democracies today. We're doing it wrong, or they're wrong, or something. So we got to fix this problem. And maybe maybe it's not a good idea. Maybe democracy isn't going to work anymore, if it ever did. Okay, so I think I spent a lot of time on that question. What's the matter with democracies today? And so I was just entranced by the title of his book, and I want to talk to him about it. So he and I are all alone together, along with you, and we're going to have a little conversation about whether we can fix the world. And hello, David.
Hello.
Great to meet you.
It's very nice to meet you.
Yeah, right. So I love the title of your book. I love some of the ways you approach the question, which wouldn't have even occurred to me. My orientation is to think that either we need to be better educated about civics and the world, reality, or we need to fix our social relationships so we need to understand that we have to stand up against our friends sometimes if we want to have any kind of integrity. Those are the things that bother me. But you started off right away with a discussion of the brain, how people think, and even neurological problems. And in a way, that kind of threw me, but you didn't stick with it too long. And I feel, actually, you got a point there, because let's start off with that. Tell me, why don't you give us a little précis of your basic argument in the book, and then I'm going to come back and ask you about the brain. Okay?
Sure. So thank you very much for having me. Now, the argument of the book, which came out of my dissertation, I'm a deliberative democratic theorist by training, and I took the work I did during my dissertation and committed the cardinal academic sin of writing a mass market book. Because to me, it was more important to have popularly available work on this that I could disseminate to policymakers and to the general public to try to affect how we think about democracy personally and institutionally. And the argument of the book is simple. It's that we often think that we are too dumb for democracy, that we lack the capacity to make good political decisions, which we can talk about later, the definition of good. My argument is we often do make terrible political decisions. We often fall far short of who we want to be or who we might think we are, and certainly far short of who the Enlightenment imagined us to be. And yet we have the capacity to make rational, autonomous, shareable, and consistent good political decisions. That's how I define good. But that takes personal work and training, and it takes institutional support. Only with those two tracks can we make good political decisions consistently. And we ought to care about making good political decisions, because not only do we, by that way, get better outcomes that are more justifiable, that better serve people, that are more legitimate, we also underwrite democratic foundations. We make democracy more likely to last in the long run. And if there's ever been a more important time in democratic life to make good political decisions, I can't think of it. It seems to be right now, because we can lose it. Because undergirding the whole endeavor here is the idea that democracies are really hard to establish, really hard to extend universally, but really easy to lose. And democracy has been the historical exception to the rule. They don't come around often, and when they do, they don't last very long. And we might have thought that we'd reached the end of history in the 1990s, but we were proven wrong pretty quickly. And not only were we proven wrong, it could be the case that we were proven that we actually had it backwards, that we actually had it right on backwards, that in fact, we hadn't reached this end of history in the term as being liberal democracy, but actually it was the beginning of the end of liberal democracy, and that's what we're fighting back against.
I think what shook me, made me rethink a little bit, was you're starting off by actually talking about how the brain works, and and it made me think, yeah, you know, I've never for many years I used to be kind of interested in social psychology, but I wasn't for a long time. Mostly I'm a political sociologist, and I think in terms of political structures and reforming things by making policy decisions and that kind of thing, and not trying to change the nature of human beings, the voters or anybody else. But, you know, it's making me wonder, and this is not germane exactly to the argument of your book, but it certainly makes me wonder if mental illness or mental, emotional, character, personality issues are not becoming more severe in these days, and that to such a degree as to actually influence our public discourse and capacity to get work done. I wouldn't have begun to reduce political issues to neurological ones, and I still don't think that's much of the way to go. But mention that a little bit before we move on to what I think we really have to talk about.
Well, I don't want to reduce them either. And in fact, sort of to speak to what you were talking about in regards to mental health, I would say that we're suffering several crises, mental health crises in this country and more broadly around the world. And I wouldn't look to, well, I would look to institutions that exacerbate those things and say, you know, what is it about the structure of our democracy? What is it the structure of capitalism in the marketplace that either encourages those mental health challenges or makes them worse? And think about paid sick leave, for instance, or think about how corporations will pay lip service to mental health, but then produce working conditions that make people's lives miserable, more difficult to live. Think about sort of the culture of production and efficiency and the demands that we have of people that are incommensurate with the resources they end up getting, and then think about what kind of world that produces. And the reason that's relevant to what I'm talking about is, you know, you don't have time to be a good citizen if you're just struggling to get through the day for whatever reason. I mean, part of the reason we need to support people is because it's just right to do it. But also part of it is because we want citizens who have time to be citizens. But when I think of the brain in terms of this book, I think by way of Antonio Damasio, who's a neuroscientist, whose book, Looking for Spinoza, was one of the things that really got me thinking about politics by way of the brain. And he said the reason we should pay attention to the brain is that to the extent that we can understand how people tend to behave, we can design institutions for them. That the future of our institutions, the future of our politics, and our policies ought to, at least in part, reflect an understanding of the human brain. Now, when I started doing my dissertation research, I found that that neuroscience wasn't a good way for me to engage. It was just too fine-grained. You know, we couldn't draw reliable conclusions. The fMRI research that was being done on this stuff was really early and unreliable. So I thought social psychology is actually where I want to look. And I wanted to understand how we behave individually in groups so that we can start thinking about why we do the things we do and how we might understand that so that we can make better decisions. And so, for instance, I started learning about biases. And I wanted to understand those and where does that come from? And if you start looking at political decision makers as humans who are fundamentally biased, we like the people we like, we dislike the people we dislike. We tend to listen to those we like and not listen to those we dislike, no matter what the message might be. We're cognitive misers. We like to do the most possible with the least resources, which means we often leap to conclusions or just read a headline and don't read the story and so on. Or we have to make a political decision. We don't want to have the time or resources, so we'll just look to someone we trust and say, well, I'm going to do what they do, whether it's a someone in professional life, in our families, or a political party, or whatever it might be, a professional association. And what I'm saying is we need to understand that behavior if we're going to say, how do we produce decisions that people can claim as their own, that are based on information in the world, but also based on reasons that they've come up with. And so my way of starting with the brain is by way of getting to social psychology, which is by way of getting to personal practice and institutional design, so that we can support better decision-making infrastructure.
Yeah, I had years and years ago given up the idea of working, trying to change the world by changing people. I thought social psychology was a kind of a fun thing to do out of curiosity, or any other form of psychology. But I wouldn't try to fix social problems that way because it seems so much an intractable aspect of the human condition to these are not things that are easily fixed. I could write a constitution for a whole society more easily than I could do therapy with an average client, I think. But that's the problem, because I think, in fact, many, if not most, of the difficulties we're having with our political institutions comes from the fact that we are so dumb or so screwed up, and we're not making reasonable decisions, or not even trying to decide things on reasonable grounds. And when I say we, I include myself, because I know that I could spend my whole time doing research on the political issues of the day in order to be as well informed about anything as possible, like COVID, for whether I should take chloroquine or whatever pills. I mean, I'd have to really study a lot of medicine. I can't do that. If pipelines, what do I know about pipelines? I can study it, but I'm not going to be an expert on it. And if I were to think about all the other political decisions that I have to make in my life, I could never get smart enough to really be confident that I'm making smart decisions. And I think I'm, got a passable IQ. So I think if it's true of me, it's true of everybody. And it is partly also, I have to say, sometimes personality issues. People don't have things like qualities like patience, or various kinds of temperamental orientations that interfere with good judgment. So I think psychological things are, unfortunately, really have to be in the equation. And yet I guess I think that is the hardest thing in the world to try to solve. But so I take seriously your question. The question in the title of your book, Too Dumb for Democracy, I think there's a lot of influence. I think there's a lot of evidence that right now democracies are in deep trouble, and maybe they always were and I wasn't paying attention. I mean, maybe the problems that we're facing have been there all along, but they weren't just quite as bad as they were in situations where we have such fateful decisions to make, and we're making such bad ones. So, I mean, I think electing Trump was evidence that we've got a sick society out there. And I think that's the only word for it, that this is not a healthy situation. And it means that I think we have to say that large parts of many Democratic electorates are not making rational decisions, and are in fact tend to make decisions that are so contrary to even their own interests that it'll be fatal. It can be fatal. I mean, really, we can do such dumb things that the human population may collapse because of the stupid decisions that are possible for us to make right now. So even though in the long run, your book comes up with recommendations on how to fix the institutions, and I don't think I disagree with your recommendations. And I think we have to explore some recommendations that might also be added to the mix. I'm not sure we're going to win.
Well, one of the things I found fascinating when I was writing the book was I went back through history and tried to find the golden age, and it just wasn't there. I mean, it was really difficult to find any sustained period of time that you would look to and say, oh, they had it figured out. I mean, either it was deeply prejudiced, exclusionary, violent, short-lived, unstable, whatever it might be, right? I mean, there was no golden age where we'd figured out and we had said, okay, well, there we go. We've got it. Now it's just set it and forget it. Even, when you look at the United States and you say, well, look at Trump. He's everything that's wrong with American democracy. What happened? You don't have to go all that far back to find similar problems, right? I mean, first of all, the country was founded on two unforgivable sins of indigenous genocide and slavery. So from the get-go, it was fundamentally broken and fundamentally evil. I mean, those are evil institutions and acts. But then you had Andrew Jackson. Then you had, periods of deep racial prejudice, racism, hatred, and exclusion and death, right? I mean, for a very long time. And then you had the rise of fascism in the US, or at least fascist sympathy in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. And you had Nazi rallies in New York, in Madison Square Garden. And you had Charles Lindbergh in America First. And then you had Nixon, who wanted to annihilate countries by way of nuclear weapons every week. It had to be talked down. And so it's hard to find a time when it actually looks good if you get rid of all the myth making at the top. So what and we can have a similar conversation about England and France and Canada and all the countries we look to as, good democracies. So what I'm trying to say is that what we ultimately want to do is create institutions that can support inclusivity and can support human flourishing. And those things have to be fundamentally inclusive, both symbolically inclusive, but materially inclusive above all. People need to have resources. They need to be in the room. They need to have a chance to speak and be heard. And that's everybody. And now, once we've ensured that, we can also work on ensuring that people have good decision-making processes. So I talk about both the individual processes, but the institutional supports. And I think the institutional supports are the fundamentally important thing, because my sense and my argument is that if you get that right, the institutional stuff, especially the material support, then the psychological side, the individual side, that becomes a lot easier to take care of if it doesn't just fix itself. Because I do think a lot of the pathologies and a lot of the struggles and a lot of what we're seeing as facilitating the breakdown comes from that. And that's not going to solve everything, but it's certainly going to make it easier to solve the fundamental institutional problems. And that's something we ought to pursue, because I agree with you. It's really hard to sit down and inefficient to try to work on people one at a time. But if you can change those institutions, it becomes a lot easier.
I don't know what the term institution here, I'm not sure is exactly the right one. I'm thinking back to the 60s when I was the research assistant for Seymour Martin Lipset for 5 years. And I assisted in writing a book that he did called The Politics of Unreason, which was a history of right-wing illiberal politics, I've forgotten the extremist politics in the US. And he talks about Father Coughlin and all these, some of the people you've already mentioned, and there are a lot of others I'd never even heard of before. But it was at a time, I was at Harvard when there was a busing issue in Boston about, there was a lot of opposition among white parents about busing their children, Black and white children, to mix them up and that kind of thing. So there was a real issue. Now, the conclusion that he made basically in that book was that there are two kinds of conservatism. One would be, I guess today we would take Mitt Romney as a perfect example of it. That is kind of well-heeled people, well-educated people with liberal traditions, civil rights, and their convictions are very, very much supportive of human rights and so on. And on the other hand, you have the rednecks who are bigots or whatever, racists and so on. And fortunately, the Republican Party had to combine both strains of them, and these elite Mitt Romney types, the old guard we call them, were strong enough to withstand the populist movement of people who wanted to prevent busing, for example, or racial integration at the time in general was still at stake. And because the Republican Party was divided in that way, they balanced each other out enough to constrain the rednecks. All right, but Lipset winds up the book with a statement. Yeah, so far so good, because in general over the history of the U.S., there's been enough elitism, if you will. He didn't use that word, but I would now. To restrain the worst populist sentiments, but there's no guarantee that's going to continue. And he did not predict that it would be maintained. And I think today he would say, well, Trump is exactly the guy who showed that, in fact, by now the Republican Party is completely in his pocket. And but that's, of course, only the U.S. we're talking about. And if you want to talk about the U.K., we'll talk about, Boris Johnson. Or if you want to talk about Hungary, we'll talk about Orban. And you name it, we can find the similar kinds of tensions between two kinds of conservatism that are quite antithetical to each other, and that restrained the whole conservative movement enough, or at least the right wing, the bigoted part, in order to allow more liberal political forces to maintain. Now, is that an institutional change? No, I think it was just good luck. I just think we've been lucky enough to keep the worst sentiments from winning enough votes to be elected. And I don't know that there's any change in either party that would have made that happen.
There's in How Democracies Die, the Ziblatt and Levitsky book, they talk a little bit about this. I mean, one of the things I don't know if they say this directly, but I think it fits. To the extent that the Romney type conservatives, and you would probably put George H.W. Bush and maybe even George W. Bush to some extent in that pile.
Today.
Yeah, today you certainly would. In retrospect, you certainly would. Uh-huh. You might say they were complicit nonetheless in preserving a lot of the more explicitly racist, even authoritarian, and even fascistic, if not downright fascist, elements of conservatism in America. That they might not have got along with them, but there was a lot of winking and nudging and leaving them be. And in fact, one of the arguments about the breakdown of American democracy in the contemporary moment is that it stems from movements in the 1960s, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, to try to address explicit racism in the South, and that sort of had broken an elite consensus to let it be, and hence had caused a lot of the conflict that's played out the way it has now. But I mean, I see those structures as so inherently prejudicial and exclusionary that you had a veneer of sort of respectability, but underneath that veneer, the foundation was rotting. And I worry that eventually it just rots away and you get what you get now. And so, how do the question then becomes, how do you address that? I mean, for instance, what I'm seeing in the streets of the United States right now, the police brutality, to me, that's not a surprise. I mean, to me, that's always been there. And it's been expressed plenty of times in the past, sometimes publicly, but presumably quite often privately, or at least by outside of camera view. That's always been there. So that the remaking of that democracy has to be a teardown job that says, that involves a process of truth and reconciliation to say, here are the structural crimes that have been committed by this country for centuries, and now we've got to have to tear that down. For instance, I think the American democracy is a teardown job, and that once torn down, the work of remaking it ought to be led by those who have been marginalized for centuries, and that has to be remade in a more egalitarian and participatory model. And so one of the big themes that I keep coming back to in my book is egalitarianism, and another is participatory democracy. Not that I want to undo representative democracy, because I like having time to do things as a person, not as a citizen all the time, and no one should have to be a full-time citizen. But you want to have people embedded in government in a participatory role so that they can get what they want. But I argue that those structures should be deliberative. And that's the big moment where I try to, I sort of depart from a lot of others and say, I want those things to be based on reason giving. I want them to be based not necessarily on consensus, but at least an attempt to understand the other person and to engage with them. Now, there are some people you can't do that with, include people with a blackjack or a baton who are beating on you, for instance, or Donald Trump. But a lot of people you can engage with. And that those deliberative institutions are better than just putting your hand up and voting at the end of the day, or using money or so on and so forth to try to sway the argument. So, I was trying to make a broader, if implicit, argument for a sort of quasi-revolutionary politics that I thought could be constructive. Of course, that's the outline of a vision. There's a lot of specifics that need to go with that, and I'm not there yet. I don't know if any of us are, and someone must be, but I'm not.
Well, it seems to me you ask the right question, but I don't think you've answered it, and I think you, in a way, didn't pursue the question all the way. I mean, if you take the question seriously, are ordinary voters, normal, non-crazy, perfectly healthy people capable of making democracy work? Is democracy just inherently incapable of containing enough deliberation to come up with generally wise decisions? I'm not sure that I know the answer to that, and I'm leaning in a direction that I sure wish I didn't lean. I mean, I can't remember the name of the book, but a couple of years ago I was reading something about some guys were taking the contrary position, and they were showing how, for example, the case of Woodrow Wilson. He was running for something in New Jersey when he was at Princeton, I guess, I don't know. But at any rate, it was at a time when there were a lot of shark attacks on the Jersey Shore that summer. And the reason he didn't get elected was, I may be distorting this, but the story is a good one, and whether it's true exactly, I don't know. But he didn't get elected because people held it against him that there were all those shark attacks. The politicians shouldn't have allowed such a thing to happen. And if you look at the actual other figures, in an election in a rural area, when there's a drought, the incumbent is going to be probably defeated because the people hold the climate against the politicians. And if it didn't turn out right, they'll get elect a new politician, et cetera. What I'm saying is that people vote, they're not crazy, they're not crazy, but they're sure not rational. And this kind of decision making is something that I don't know that we're going to be able to eradicate by teaching them. What are you going to do? I think that this happens. Now, what's worse than even that is, for a few years, you mentioned the Citizens Assembly. I was very involved with the Helsinki Citizens Assembly during the 80s. And because I believed in that too. And my solution to this was that we would do better to turn more decision-making over to, or rather incorporate in democratic institutions, non-governmental organizations, so that small groups that had, environmental groups or feminist groups or consumer groups or child welfare groups, or, people who had particular concerns about issues, would be well represented in our institutions. And to some extent that's happening in the UN, because you have the various NGOs able to sit in the same room as the real delegations sometimes. Or I have actually made speeches from, wearing one of these little white things on my ear years ago when there was at the UN, when you do these things, they include NGOs, citizens there, much more participatory. And I had sort of pinned my hopes for correcting democracy on the notion of, I think David Held at LSE took this kind of position, that you can incorporate NGOs into democratic institutions and have more deliberation that way, more reasonable discourse. Only I'm an activist, and I'm a member of a number of different organizations. And I tell you, I've seen things happen in these group dynamics that totally destroy my faith that small group dynamics are going to save us. If anything, they are less democratic than governmental institutions, where you have the right to appeal, or you have structures of justice and that sort of thing. I'm more concerned about the failure of democracy in volunteer organizations than I am in organizations like a state that's governed by a constitution with, a Supreme Court and all that. So I'm the devil's advocate now, and I sure don't want to be. Tell me how to go, fella.
So I'll give you my politics by way of characterizing, or contextualize what I'm about to say. I believe in market socialism, anti-imperialist, participatory deliberative, complemented by representative institutions, all by way of helping ensure an inclusive pluralist space. So a lot of the hope I have for the future of a just, egalitarian, democratic society is bound up in making sure that we have a deep pluralism, so that we have a democratic system that has a bunch of different groups and individuals and interests and forces who are more or less equally working, sometimes cooperating, sometimes against one another, sometimes deliberating, and so on, to figure out how we should live together. My concern now is, right now, what we actually have is a sort of oligopoly or plutocracy, right? And we have biased pluralism. Now, the power and the resources tend to pool. So I think of these things as, if we get them right, playing out on aggregate pretty well, but only if we're able to democratize our political institutions, but also our economy. And I think a big part of solving a lot of the democratic woes that we have is democratizing the economy, putting more power into the hands of groups, of individuals, of workers, because that also translates into political power. And so I want to smooth that out a little bit. Now, I don't think you're ever going to be able to undo the challenges of group dynamics. I don't think you're ever going to be able to say, we're going to democratize everything, that every little group, every NGO, big or small, every institution is going to be democratic, because I think there are just some instances where that can't happen. And I've seen it play out. You see it play out all over the place, in NGOs, in faculties. I mean, my Lord, faculties are a great example of how democracy might not work, right? But the key to me is still on aggregate to support inclusive, deliberative political participation through egalitarianism and capacity building, because on aggregate, the political system gets better. And that last part is really important, thinking about our system as a system rather than just an election or voting. Because, the story you tell about the shark attack, that's in it appears in lots of places, but one of the places is in Rick Shankman's book on politics and the brain, Political Animals, I think it's called. And it's disconcerting. And there's lots of stories like that. But if you start to think of a political system as having elections and courts and legislatures and citizens' assemblies and participatory budgeting and NGOs and protests and civil disobedience and all sorts of different touchstones or contact points, then there's some hope that on aggregate we do okay. And I think part of enhancing and preserving democracy is having these different points at which political action is happening, and there are different avenues to advocating for what you might want. And so a big part of that, my hope, is in democratizing these institutions to the extent that it's possible across the board and providing material support to make that work. But how you do that becomes obviously the critical question. But I do think we're reaching a point where there's going to be critical junctures at which we can decide that we want to live differently. I think the pandemic is one of them. I think the climate crisis is one of them too. That we've just reached a point where we have to make big decisions about how we want to live together, and we can't justify the old ways anymore. We couldn't really justify them before, but we certainly can't justify them now. So I do have some hope that we're reaching and have reached critical junctures that are going to allow us an opportunity to remake these practices and institutions. And I'm looking to the ground. I'm looking to organizers. I'm looking to thinkers and writers and so on, and seeing a lot of that activity happening already. So I'm actually a little bit optimistic at times.
Okay. I think you and I would agree that we can get to a point where we have to say, this isn't working. We have to make some changes. The climate is going to get us, or COVID is going to get us. We have to change, but that doesn't mean necessarily people will change. Civilizations have died. And there's no guarantee ours won't be the next one, and pretty damn soon.
Well, we like to think of ourselves as really clever, right? And we look back on the ancients and like to scoff. But is there a big difference between the Sumerians farming themselves to death by salinating their fields and us shepherding post-industrial revolution an era of climate catastrophe? I see no difference there. To me, that's the same thing.
I agree. Assuming, of course, that the Sumerians knew better.
Susan Weisbauer argues that they did, because I wondered that too.
Okay, well, I won't quibble with that, because I'm thinking now of my friend Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in Their Own Land. And she goes to Louisiana and hangs out with these people because she's trying to understand why people would elect, in a real democracy, a government that will do exactly the contrary to their own interests. I mean, the red states, as she points out, and Louisiana's one of the worst, they have the worst educational system. They have the worst environment. They're being poisoned by the petrochemical industry. They have the worst health system, the worst infrastructure. They have the worst economy. You have everything just the worst that could possibly be. And these people know it. And she says they look out their back porch and they see the water from the bay or whatever, and it's full of chemicals. And they see these guys come and pour chemicals in there, and they know that their own family members, several of them, have died from this chemical. They know that. And if you ask them, do you want the EPA to come and fix this so that they can't do that? No. We have to have, this is where our jobs are or something. They're not even, but so they do not do the things that are in their own interest. Now, to me, that is the real mystery, because if you have people who continuously vote the wrong people into power, people who are going to do them harm, then our civilization could be cooked. We really may be on the downside, because people will not necessarily, even if they see, well, you see the pandemic in the US and other countries, but the US has the worst record now worse fatalities and so on. And they just because it's an emergency doesn't mean they're going to rise to the occasion and do the right things. No. And do I know enough about how to cure, what kinds of policies would solve the pandemic or reduce the death rate? No. Could I find out quickly enough? No. I think we have to have expertise, and the role of the expert has been debunked. People now will say outright, I don't want to have anything more to do with experts. Thank you. We are a democracy. We'll decide for ourselves without thinking and without trying to look at any evidence. So the expert has been dethroned. And I think really we need to have some way of replacing expertise in the decision-making process, even for people who are smart, but who just plain could not master all of the knowledge that's necessary in order to make wise decisions. I think maybe some government bureaucrats are probably better informed than the average voter, but of course you don't want to turn your government over just to the ministry of this or the department of that. Although I think maybe I'm looking favorably back on the old Chinese system where they gave people an exam. If you want to work in the government, you have to pass an exam. Maybe we should at least give a few tests to find out whether people know anything before giving power to them. I don't quite know how that would work, but that would be an institutional change of the kind that, I don't know how you'd feel about that.
Well, I find the bigger problem is that, as my supervisor, Mark Warren at UBC would say, expertise in a democracy has no pre-political authority. That to the extent that experts are going to be involved in public policy, all of that should be run through the democratic system. And that's in part because we disagree about who the experts are. We disagree about what their findings are. We disagree about what the implications of those findings might be. We also disagree about how we prioritize and care about X, Y, or Z. So, the trick is finding a way to have expertise in decision-making without becoming a technocracy, without saying, well, we're just going to let the experts govern. Because if you look at some of the data, and Pew had a study on this, poll on this years ago, people were sort of comfortable with autocracy. They were sort of comfortable with military rule even. But they were really comfortable, like 50-50 comfortable with technocracy, ruled by experts, which to me indicated that people just wanted answers, right? They didn't care about the process. They just wanted the outcome. My argument against that is the process protects the outcome. So you want the democratic process, because if you give it away, who knows what happens? And you probably don't get an agenda, a legislative agenda, a policy agenda that reflects what the population at large wants, including those who might get marginalized. So you want to be careful about experts. But the reason I argue for deliberation is that that's a good example of how you center individuals and encourage them to think and reflect, to take time and to develop capacities, but then to rely on the expertise, to say that the expertise and what those experts produce are the fodder that you're going to use as the individual to come up with a good decision. And we see that play out when we get good institutional setups like a citizens assembly that's well designed, or a participatory budgeting exercise that's well designed, or a legislature that takes deliberation seriously. So we do know that it can work. And in fact, that expertise becomes an asset, not a liability. But I worry, and this is exactly what you were talking about, that there are elite forces that seek to demonize expertise, that seek to undermine the interests of the public because they want to win and they've got an agenda. And you see that with the Republican Party in the United States right now. You see it in Canada too. And it's frightening. And returning to How Democracies Die, the Ziblatt and Levitsky book, they say that one of the biggest threats to democracy is a lack of forbearance. That there are things that elites can do and get away with, but that they shouldn't do, like demonize experts, for instance, or demonize their opponents. And when they don't do that, democracy is healthier. When they do it, it's less healthy. And in the US, the forbearance has just disappeared. I don't know how you get that back, because you could see that spiral emerge, right? Because then it becomes tit for tat, and just everybody does it. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't the Democrats the Democrats bork the Republicans. Why wouldn't the Republicans turn around and do that to Merrick Garland? So, I don't know how you reverse that spiral. And that's the thing that I'm most worried about, is that forbearance is disappearing, and it's the demonization is making a lot of those institutional challenges impossible.
Well, I had a conversation about 2 hours ago with somebody in Kuwait, really, philosopher there. And we were talking about something related to this. I think now in the world globally, and we see it in the US too, the basic underlying tension is between two political cultures, one being basically urban, sophisticated, educated people versus rural, traditional, not very well educated people. And it's not really about class so much. It isn't, I mean, poor people and rich people both can be in this category. Matter of fact, I think the people who voted for Trump had a higher income level than the people who voted for Hillary Clinton. So it isn't just about money, although certainly that can be part of it. But it's about dignity and a feeling that one is excluded from one's own society by all these, immigrants or people with different cultures, and that the elites and sophisticated people are perfectly happy welcoming these foreigners with their weird ways, and yet the traditional old stock Americans, let's say, have lost prestige in the hierarchy, and that is what's bothering people. Well, it seems to me that as a peace activist, I see two different ways of functioning. One is wanting to improve the transactions, the bargains, the deals, the rational dispute resolution between different factions. And the other is wanting to keep a good relationship. I want to have a warm, friendly family. And some members of my family have points of view that I absolutely deplore. So for the sake of keeping peace in the family or among my friends, I may just shut up and not object or not argue with them. So I'll give up on the power struggle, if you will, in order to keep a good relationship. And really, some of these conflicts are over very fundamental issues that really we shouldn't give up on. We have to defend. I mean, so I personally don't know how to be friendly and warm in talking with, let's say, a racist who's, out to defend police brutality or something of that kind. I don't know how. I'm not very polite. I get angry, or I can't let my desire for a good relationship take priority over my convictions about political and social values. So it shows, and I'm not a good person to be a peacemaker. I'm not sufficiently forbearant.
Well, I mean, I would say there are moments where you shouldn't be. I mean, I think the reason I like to talk about democratic systems is because sometimes you can deliberate, sometimes you can litigate, sometimes you can vote, sometimes you need to put your body down on the railroad track. Sometimes you need Wet'suwet'en, sometimes you need the protests in the United States, and that's not about deliberation. That's about saying these avenues have not worked, or they haven't worked on their own, and we're going to do something different in concert with deliberation, litigation, policy, policy pressure. I believe that the rule is that you want to do the right thing for the right reason in the right way, and what that's going to be is it's going to play out differently in different contexts, right? Rather than trying to be Kantian about it and say, oh no, there's a categorical imperative. It has to be this. It has to be this all the time, and that's the only right way. And my approach is more that there's actually a lot of wisdom in figuring out what fits where and when. And that's why, for instance, during the Wet'suwet'en crisis in Canada earlier this year, if someone had said to me, what do you think should should be done by those who want change, I would say exactly what's being done. I wouldn't say, oh, go through the policy process or go through a deliberation. I would say, let's take to the streets. And I was, lucky enough to very briefly be out with some folks in Ottawa. And that moment I thought, this is powerful and present. And I'm certainly happy to see people out there in the streets doing this, when other people are saying, oh, why don't you just use, the courts or the legislation or whatever. It's like, no, we need this. This is sort of a fixed thing. And when I look at the generation, well, sort of my generation, but certainly the generations that are following me and mine, I see a lot of hope there that they're embracing this. And actually, in fact, contrary to a lot of the narratives about the sort of apathetic youth, I think there's a growing consciousness and presence and energy among young people, especially those who've been traditionally marginalized, who are taking up more and more space and demanding better through all kinds of different avenues. And I actually have a lot of hope there, that there is this sort of political awakening and energy. Because I gotta say, I've never met an apathetic person in my life, but I've met a lot of alienated people. And there's a big difference between those two things. One implies that people don't care. That's not true. They care. It's the fact that they're alienated and marginalized. And I think there's a lot of pushback against that. And I have a lot of hope that those folks are going to seize this moment and the moments to come to remake a lot of what we do and how we do it.
Okay, you referred to the distinction between being out in the streets using fairly strong methods of expression versus being quiet and going through the courts or doing less confrontational methods. That's not really the distinction I was making, because I think both righteous people and terrible sinners can take to the streets, and it doesn't say anything about how right or wrong the policy is. So that's not the distinction I mean. The distinction I'm aiming at is the motivation for taking a particular side or not. How do we decide which side we're going to line up on? And my feeling is that much too often, in fact, right now, people are accurately saying that politics, at least in the US, and I don't know how much it's true in other countries, but that really it's come down to tribalism. It's like voting Republican or Democrat is like deciding whether you're for the Yankees or the Dodgers or whatever team it is. I don't know, do Dodgers even exist anymore? But I'm not much of a baseball fan. But that's the general idea, what team you're on. And you support that team, whether it's right or wrong. And Donald Trump was right when he said I could go out on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and my followers would say, oh, it's okay. And they still do. So once you've taken a position, it has nothing to do with whether it's in your own interest, whether the politician is doing what's right for your well-being, or is doing absolutely the worst thing in the world, something that will jeopardize the fate of humankind. He's your guy. If he's on your side and you've chosen his team, you're loyal. And this comes out from the desire to be accepted by one's peer group. If you go back to was it in the 40s when the Solomon Asch experiment took place? The guy shows, this experiment is very famous, wonderful old example of how people want to conform. And they especially want to conform even more. Irving Janis used to show, they especially want to conform to a group that they value very highly. But it started off with, they'd show two different lines, and they'd have 6 people come in, and they would ask each one in a row, which one is longer, this one or this one? And they had it all fixed, so the first 6 or 6 or whatever would give the wrong answer. Then you'd come to the real subject, and you ask him, and he would give the wrong answer too, even though any fool could see which was the longer line. They would make the wrong decisions, and people do that. They do that because they don't want to be a nonconformist. If other people see this as longer line, well, I guess I'll go along with it. And that is really, and then this guy Janis puts up a study of Kennedy's cabinet, when he made decisions about the Bay of Pigs and then later about this Cuban Missile Crisis, and how it was all social psychology. It was all the desire of the people to be part of the group, and they wouldn't criticize each other. If somebody had a goofy idea, nobody would say that's a goofy idea. So it's really important to overcome that. People want to go along with the group, and especially if it's a group that they value. They'd like to be accepted in that group. So they'll go ahead and say whatever it takes to be accepted. Now, when politics comes down to that kind of mindlessness, democracy cannot work, my friend. It cannot work. And your institutional changes are not going to succeed. That's where I'm stuck. I want you to be right. And I don't know that you are.
That worries me a lot too. And you know, Aikens and Bartels have this book, Aiken and Bartels have this book called Democracy for Realists. And they argue that, but in the context of US partisanship. And US partisanship is particularly strong. And in fact, what it is an identity. It's not just something you vote. It's something you are, right? You're not a Republican or Democratic voter. You are a Republican or Democrat. You see the world as a Republican or Democrat. And in fact, that partisanship becomes not just an identity, but a lens. And so you shape your objective worldview about the economy, about what's good, about what's bad, about whether or not someone's performing well or not, through the lens of that partisan identity. And that's a huge problem. But it does vary, right? And so the little hope that I have is that there are objective differences about the quality of democracy, policy outcomes, and partisan identity in country A and country B. The US is one of the worst examples. Canada's a little bit better. And in fact, the partisanship rates among young people right now, for instance, in Canada, have never been lower. So in fact, when it comes to partisanship, at least, there are fewer partisans in Canada than there maybe ever has been. And so there is a way to push back against partisanship. I don't know that there's a way to eliminate loyalties, sort of like group loyalties. I think they're always going to be there because they're deeply a part of who we are. But we can try to temper them and limit them and direct them. And if you imagine an egalitarian pluralist society, you can sort of smooth them out by having a bunch of different competing groups. And so that doesn't eliminate that connection. But again, I don't know that you'd want to eliminate that connection ultimately. Because again, as Antonio Damasio talks about this when he says, you know, if you were to take emotion out of decision-making, you wouldn't have perfect decision-makers, you'd have psychopaths. And his argument is that we need these connections. We need these affinities and these sympathies. We need that capacity for empathy and for group identification. We just want to kind of temper its more deleterious effects because it becomes toxic if it becomes partisan idea in the US that's exacerbated by elites who want to try to use it as a bludgeon. So there is some hope that we can manage a little bit of that. But again, I would compare the US and Canada and say there's a lot more hope, for instance, here than there is in the US. I mean, but it's not as many people as you might think, right? I mean, it's, you know, a lot of the worst of the trouble is being caused by a minority of folks who, like, the real partisan extremists on the wings aren't a majority of Americans. And so part of it is finding a way to at least attenuate that toxic minority of ideological partisans who are making a mess, both on the left and the right, because it's a problem for the Democrats as much as not as much. It's a problem for more of a problem for the Republicans, but it also happens with Democrats. And you saw that in the primaries, for instance. So it certainly is endemic.
Yeah, you say not so many, but, you know, Trump was elected and you can say, well, it was really the Russians who elected him. Not quite, but you know, okay, it wasn't quite a fair election and I want to get rid of the Electoral College. Nevertheless, he might get elected again, even straightforwardly, you know. So it's not a trivial matter. The problem here is serious.
Yeah.
And you know, have we come up with anything that both of us feel convinced is a real answer? What institutional change would you bet your bottom dollar on?
Globally or in Canada or the US?
Well, I don't know. I hadn't thought of the question.
Well, I mean, for instance, if it was in the US, one of the first things I would want to see is money out of politics. I mean, I think a huge part of what's toxic about American politics is the influence of money and the conception of money as speech, because it does really pool power. And if you looked at that Gillens and Page piece from a couple of years ago, they sort of say between the 1970s and whatever it was, 2008, 2012, the vast majority of policy in the US was made by elites for elites, and a huge part of that is money. If it's in Canada, economically, I would want to say, for instance, a sort of push for market socialization where a lot of ownership goes to workers and goes to collectives. If it's on the political side, I want to see standing deliberative assemblies. I really think there's a lot of power in standing deliberative assemblies, both to come up with policies, but to agenda set as well, to say that this is what a randomly selected group of citizens wants, and to give politicians a sense of things that might not be on their radar, but that are on the social radar. Because there are things that people can put to politicians collectively that politicians might not touch otherwise because it's controversial or so on. Like, think of, talking about the abolition of prisons, defunding police, aggressive climate policy, the legalization of drugs. So, these things in the hands of a citizens' assembly are going to be treated very differently than the hands of the House of Commons. To borrow from Picasso, luck should find you, or opportunity should find you working. That you do your organizing, you work to create your opportunity, but you prepare for it, and when it arrives, you seize it. And again, to return to a point I made earlier, I do think that those opportunities are coming, if not here already, because of the critical junctures that we're coming across now.
Well, all right. I for once don't have any opposition to what you said. Too bad. I'll have to go think some more before I come up with serious objections to any of your points, because I think your heart is in the right place and mine is in the same place, but my head is turned in a very different direction, and I'm really seriously worried, and I'm looking forward to maybe we can have another conversation someday, because this is very, very important, and your work, you've pointed me in a very good direction. I appreciate it. So thank you very much for this.
It was my pleasure entirely.
Yeah.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.